October 1941. A railhead outside Kuibyshev. Major Ivan Petrov pressed his gloved hand against the canvas tarpaulin covering the first American truck he'd ever seen, and the fabric crackled with ice. The Soviet Union was bleeding. Factories evacuated eastward, tank columns immobilized by fuel shortages, and artillery crews harnessing horses that dropped dead in their traces. What arrived that autumn morning would rewrite the mathematics of Soviet survival. The air at the railhead carried three distinct signatures: the metallic clank of American shipping crates being manhandled off flat cars, the acrid bite of coal smoke from idling locomotives, and the wet canvas smell of hundreds of olive-drab tarpaulins that covered something the Red Army had never possessed in such quantities. Beneath those tarps sat rows of identical trucks, Studebaker US6 Deuce-and-a-half cargo vehicles, each one capable of hauling 2.5 tons across terrain that would swallow Soviet Gaz trucks whole. The stenciled numbers on their cabs were American. The promise they represented seemed impossible. Soviet generals had spent the summer of 1941 watching the Wehrmacht's mechanized columns slice through their defenses. The Red Army's pre-war truck fleet, a patchwork of civilian conversions and aging military chassis, had been shattered in the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa. Whole rifle divisions relied on horse-drawn carts to move ammunition from rail depots to the front, a logistics system that belonged to the 19th century, facing an enemy that had mastered the 20th. When Stalin's representatives signed the first protocol with American and British officials in October 1941, Soviet planners privately doubted whether the capitalist Allies would deliver anything beyond promises and propaganda. Then the ships began arriving. From October 1st, 1941 to May 31st, 1945, the United States would deliver 427,284 trucks to the USSR under Lend-Lease. That single number represented roughly 750,000 horsepower that the Red Army simply did not possess when German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. Of those trucks, hundreds of thousands were 2.5-ton cargo trucks, the workhorses that would move Soviet artillery, fuel, and infantry between railheads and front lines for the remainder of the war. The Studebaker US6 became the most numerous single type, with production and exports to Russia commonly listed between 200,000 and 219,000 units. But in October 1941, as Major Petrov walked between rows of newly unloaded trucks in Kuibyshev, none of those final statistics existed yet. What existed was desperate improvisation meeting industrial abundance. The first US-6 shipments had arrived in autumn 1941 through multiple routes that would become arteries of Soviet survival. The Persian Corridor, running from the Iranian port of Bandar Shahpur northward by rail across Iran, would eventually carry over 4 million tons of Lend-Lease material, including thousands of trucks that arrived dusty, hot, and vital. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Archangel represented the shortest sea route but the most lethal, with cargo vessels sliced open by Luftwaffe bombers and U-boat torpedoes as they fought through pack ice and perpetual darkness. Those Arctic runs would deliver nearly 4 million tons of materiel, much of it unloaded under blizzard conditions by dock crews who worked in shifts measured in minutes before frostbite set in. Soviet logistics officers initially approached the American trucks with suspicion born of bitter experience. Foreign equipment had a reputation for failing under Russian conditions: inadequate cold weather performance, incompatible spare parts, fuel requirements that Soviet supply chains couldn't meet. An early test conducted between July 1942 and May 1943 put 11 US-6 trucks through a rigorous evaluation. The technical reports that emerged led to wider acceptance. But what truly converted skeptics was watching Studebakers start in temperatures that froze Soviet Gazi engines solid. The US-6's reputation for running on poor quality fuel and starting in sub-zero conditions made it prized on the Eastern Front. By 1942, the Persian Corridor and Arctic convoys were moving American trucks in steady streams to Soviet depots. Soviet generals who had expected to spend the war desperately improvising watched whole battalions re-equip around standardized American vehicles, a logistics shock as profound as any tactical innovation. Memoirs and later KGB intercepts record the astonishment. Foreign trucks were arriving by the thousands, and they worked. Soviet crews shortened Studebaker to Studer or Studerka, stenciling the nickname on cabs alongside Cyrillic unit markings and hand-painted hometown names. Infantry converted many into makeshift machine gun platforms. Artillerymen discovered that a Studebaker could tow 76mm and 122mm guns, haul a squad with ammunition, or be refitted to carry the 16-rocket BM-13 Katyusha launcher that would become the signature Soviet artillery weapon. But the trucks were only part of the equation. Lend-Lease delivered approximately 1,750,000 tons of foodstuffs to the USSR. Canned meats, sugar, flour, salt. Russian peasants described seeing meat in tins for the first time, an exotic concept that became a lifeline as domestic agriculture collapsed under German occupation and forced evacuations. 2,670,000 tons of petroleum products arrived, including nearly 90% of the USSR's high-octane aviation fuel. Without that fuel, Soviet aircraft would have been grounded and mechanized formations immobilized regardless of how many tanks Soviet factories produced. The arrival of fleets of identical trucks simplified spare parts logistics in ways that Soviet officers hadn't imagined possible. Instead of cannibalizing random pre-war chassis, each one requiring different bolts, different bearings, different carburetors, regimental garages could swap wheel hubs and pistons between Studebakers as if drawing from a common pool. Tire scarcity remained constant, but American tires and spare wheels arrived in crates and were treated as prized currency at forward repair points. At front railheads in winter 1942, the air smelled of diesel, coal smoke, and wet canvas. Drivers used engine heat to thaw frozen boots while engines idled for hours to keep oil flowing. Many Soviet truck drivers were young male conscripts or women volunteers, pressed into service as fuel shortages and tire wear meant long, irregular shifts, repairing punctures by hand with improvised patches. Maintenance scenes played out in frozen field garages under unforgiving skies, grease-blackened hands, cheeks smeared with fuel, the metallic tang of brake shoe dust. Mechanics pried frozen carburetors with hot water poured from thermoses while the camp smelled of burning timber and thawing grease. What would you have thought, standing at that Kuibyshev railhead in October 1941, watching American trucks roll off flat cars by the dozen? Would you have believed that these olive-drab machines represented not just vehicles, but the industrial sinew of Allied victory? The trucks were arriving. The question was whether they would arrive fast enough, in sufficient numbers, to change the course of a war that Germany seemed determined to win. Before we see what happened next, take a moment and let me know. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, hit that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover. The Arctic Ocean in January 1943. Salt spray froze on deck railings before it could drip, and convoy PQ-18's escorts circled like wolves waiting for the pack to strike. These weren't just cargo runs. They were industrial lifelines threaded through a gauntlet designed to sever them. Shipboard logs from Arctic convoys record the constant thud of depth-charge explosions echoing through steel hulls, the sting of salt spray freezing instantly on clothing, and the anxious unloading at Murmansk conducted in blizzard conditions that reduced visibility to arm's length. The Arctic route, running from Iceland to Murmansk and Archangel, represented the shortest sea distance between Allied production and Soviet need. It was also the most lethal corridor of the entire war. German aircraft based in occupied Norway could reach the convoy routes in under an hour. U-boats operated from protected fjords, hunting into coordinated wolf packs. The convoys sailed through perpetual winter darkness or the midnight sun that left them exposed for German reconnaissance. Yet the ships kept coming. Between 1941 and 1945, Arctic convoys delivered 3,960,000 tons of Lend-Lease material to Soviet ports. Every ton that reached Murmansk had survived torpedo spreads, dive bomber attacks, and seas that could flip a destroyer in a single wave. Merchant sailors watched Liberty ships break apart in freezing swells, their cargoes, trucks, fuel, ammunition, vanishing into black water in minutes. The crews who survived described the metallic taste of fear mixed with the diesel fumes that permeated every compartment. The knowledge that a single torpedo could send you into water so cold that survival was measured in seconds, not minutes. But the Persian Corridor offered a different kind of ordeal. The Iranian port of Bandar Shahpur sat at the head of the Persian Gulf, where the temperature in summer could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Here, the sensory signature shifted entirely. The humid weight of Gulf air mixing with diesel exhaust, the smell of sun-baked canvas stretched over truck beds, and the gritty texture of dust that infiltrated every seal and bearing. Iranian towns along the rail route saw sudden surges of American mechanics, canvas warehouses sprouting in days, and the first sight of jeep convoys rolling through streets that had known only camels and donkeys for centuries. Local markets adapted quickly, with vendors trading cigarettes and canned fruit with Allied servicemen who spoke no Farsi and relied on gestures and broken English. The Persian Corridor carried over 4,160,000 tons of Lend-Lease material after mid-1942. It was slow, dusty, and absolutely vital for sending trucks and fuel inland to Soviet territory. The route ran from Bandar Shahpur north by rail across Iran, through mountain passes, across desert plateaus, then into Soviet territory, where the trucks could be driven directly to Red Army depots. The journey could take weeks, but unlike the Arctic route, it was relatively safe from German interdiction. The greatest threats were heat, dust, and the sheer logistical challenge of moving industrial quantities of materiel through a country whose infrastructure had been built for a different century. American trucks arrived in both theaters in a condition that shocked Soviet receiving officers, functional, standardized, and accompanied by crates of spare parts, organized with industrial precision. Soviet wartime diaries describe seeing a forest of American canvas tarpaulins at railheads where Studebaker and Ford trucks waited, their olive drab interrupted by U.S. stencil numbers and crates of Spam stacked like building blocks. At receiving depots in Kuibyshev and Gorky, the metallic clank of American crates being unloaded echoed across rail, yards that had been transformed into processing centers. Russian peasants working as civilian labor described the first sight of canned corned beef, meat in tins, as both exotic and life-saving. The concept of food that required no refrigeration, no immediate cooking, that could be stored for months and remain edible, contradicted everything they knew about food preservation. The trucks transformed more than logistics. They altered the tempo of war itself. A single Soviet rifle division in 1941 had possessed only a handful of motor vehicles. Most of them requisitioned civilian trucks that broke down within weeks of military service. By 1944, divisions often moved with hundreds of Lend-Lease trucks attached to corps and army support units. This wasn't a marginal improvement. It was a revolution in operational capability. The Red Army's ability to pursue retreating Axis forces in 1944 and 45 increased exponentially because Lend-Lease trucks could move divisions' logistics elements faster than the horse-drawn columns that had characterized Soviet supply lines in 1941. Field reports from Red Army artillerymen noted that American trucks extended how far Soviet artillery could be repositioned after a breakthrough. Instead of guns remaining tied to railheads, unable to exploit gaps in German lines because horse-drawn transport couldn't keep pace with armored spearheads, Studebakers could haul 76mm divisional guns and 122mm Corps artillery deep into enemy rear areas within hours of a breakthrough. This changed the mathematics of exploitation, the critical phase when attacking forces attempt to turn tactical success into operational collapse of enemy defenses. Industrial abundance met tactical necessity. The pace of the 1944 summer offensives, Operation Bagration, that destroyed German Army Group Center, the Baltic campaigns that liberated Estonia and Latvia, depended fundamentally on fuel and trucks to stretch supply lines hundreds of kilometers into liberated territory. Soviet tank armies could advance 50 kilometers per day, but only if fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, and repair trucks could follow them. The Studebaker became the unglamorous backbone of those advances, the vehicle that turned railroad supplies into frontline capability. Soviet mechanics developed an intimate relationship with American engineering. In winter 1942 through 43, mechanics pried frozen carburetors with hot water, while camps smelled of burning timber and thawing grease. They learned the US6's quirks, how to coax the engine to life at minus 30 degrees Celsius, which fuel mixtures would work with the low-grade gasoline that Soviet supply chains provided, how to patch tires with improvised rubber when American replacements hadn't arrived. Drivers polished headlamp glass before sorties, a mix of superstition and practical visibility, believing that a bright lamp protected against ambush. Company maintenance logs documented repair times that Soviet officers found difficult to believe. An engine rebuild that would take 3 days on a gas truck could be completed in 8 hours on a Studebaker because parts were standardized and actually available. But the trucks carried more than ammunition and fuel. British and American food tins, Spam, powdered milk, canned vegetables became common in frontline dugouts. Soldiers described a metallic, oily taste that wasn't quite like fresh meat, but calories that kept them marching when domestic food supplies had collapsed under the weight of war. Over 4,400,000 tons of foodstuffs arrived as part of Lend-Lease cargo manifests, along with thousands of boots and winter coats. In forward kitchens fed from American ration crates, the smell of boiled Spam blended with black tea and the metallic tang of the stove, an alloy of survival tastes that an entire generation of Soviet soldiers would remember. The cultural impact rippled beyond logistics. Soviet commanders initially distrusted foreign gear, conditioned by years of propaganda about self-sufficiency and capitalist unreliability. Watching Studebakers perform under conditions that destroyed Soviet vehicles created cognitive dissonance. At one railhead, a mechanic stenciled Moskva Studer on a US6 cab, a small private acknowledgment of a foreign piece of their victory. Soldiers wrote graffiti on cabs, converted trucks into personalized fighting platforms, gave vehicles nicknames and reputations. The Studebaker stopped being American and became Soviet through use, adaptation, and the blood of crews who drove them into combat. German intelligence sometimes captured Soviet motorized formations and assumed the trucks were domestically produced. They underestimated the American mechanical backbone operating at the core level, hidden behind Cyrillic stencils and Soviet camouflage paint. How do you quantify the strategic value of reliability? What price can you place on equipment that simply works when everything else fails? By 1943, Soviet rear area towns swelled with American crates, UNRWA-style warehouses, and a new class of civilian labor. Women and teenagers packing, repacking, and sewing tarpaulins to protect supplies that would feed the front. The texture of supply became familiar. Stamped tin cans, rough woven canvas, cold steel bed planks splintered by frozen cargo, ropes that cracked in sub-zero air. But as the trucks rolled westward in growing numbers, carrying Soviet armies toward Germany itself, a question hung unspoken in the minds of those who understood what they were witnessing. What would the Red Army have become without this industrial transfusion from a capitalist ally? Spring 1943, a forest clearing west of Kursk, 16 Studebaker trucks sat in a rough semicircle and welded to. Their beds were the angular frames of BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers. The Red Army was about to discover that American trucks didn't just move supplies. They could become weapons themselves. The sound that defined Soviet artillery doctrine for the rest of the war began as a metallic shriek, then became a roar as 16 rockets per truck launched in rippling salvos that turned enemy positions into storms of fragmentation and concussion. Soviet crews called the effect Stalin's organ for the sound, but they called the trucks carrying them Studers, the American chassis that made the weapon mobile, survivable, and devastatingly effective. A Katyusha battery mounted on horse-drawn carts took hours to reposition after firing, making it vulnerable to German counter-battery fire. The same battery mounted on Studebakers could fire, displace 3 kilometers in 15 minutes, and fire again before German artillery could plot their original position. This was the mechanized shock that changed the calculus of the Eastern Front. The versatility that Soviet logisticians treasured went beyond rockets. A single Studebaker could tow 76mm divisional guns across terrain that would bog-wheeled artillery, haul a full infantry squad with ammunition and machine guns, serve as a mobile command post with radio equipment powered by the truck's electrical system, or carry wounded from aid stations to field hospitals 50 kilometers behind the lines. Soviet field manuals began incorporating American truck capabilities into operational planning, something unthinkable in 1941 when horse-drawn transport defined the speed of exploitation. The transformation became visible in summer 1943 as the Red Army prepared for the counteroffensive that would follow Germany's final strategic gamble at Kursk. Soviet commanders positioned hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, and millions of artillery shells across a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. Moving that materiel from rail depots to jumping-off positions required trucks in quantities the Red Army had never possessed. American Studebakers, Dodges, and Fords became the connective tissue between railroad and battlefield. Marshal Zhukov, in a post-war recorded remark that KGB monitoring captured, acknowledged that American materiel helped form our reserves and continue the war. The admission was rare and candid. Soviet propaganda emphasized self-sufficiency and domestic heroism, rarely crediting foreign assistance. But Zhukov understood the mathematics. Soviet factories could produce T-34 tanks in quantities that stunned German intelligence. What Soviet industry couldn't produce was the fuel to run those tanks, the trucks to supply them, the high-octane aviation fuel to keep Soviet aircraft flying close air support missions, or the food to feed the crews who operated them. A supply paradox defined the Eastern Front by 1944. Soviet industry produced more tanks than in previous years, but without foreign fuel, rubber, and transport, those tanks couldn't be supplied or maintained at the needed tempo. Lend-Lease didn't just supplement Soviet production, it enabled it to matter strategically. Operation Bagration in summer 1944 demonstrated what mechanized logistics could achieve. The Soviet offensive destroyed German Army Group Center in 6 weeks, liberating Belarusia and pushing the front line 500 kilometers westward. The operation involved 2,400,000 Soviet troops, 5,000 tanks, and 36,000 artillery pieces. Every one of those soldiers needed food, water, and ammunition. Every tank required fuel and spare parts. Every gun needed shells delivered to firing positions that advanced daily. American trucks made it possible. Field reports from Soviet artillery commanders noted that Studebakers allowed them to reposition guns within hours rather than days, following the breakthrough instead of waiting for horse-drawn transport to catch up. The tempo of operations shifted. Where Soviet offensives in 1941 had ground to halt as supply lines stretched beyond horse-drawn capacity, the 1944 offensives maintained momentum deep into enemy rear areas. German commanders accustomed to Soviet logistical brittleness discovered that Red Army spearheads no longer outran their supply chains. The mechanized tide kept rolling because American trucks kept delivering. Aerial resupply couldn't match the scale. Truck-borne deliveries converted the railhead to front step from days of horse hauling into hours of motor transport. Soviet rifle divisions that once moved at walking pace, limited by how fast horses could pull supply wagons, now moved at the speed of trucks. The difference wasn't marginal, it was categorical. The texture of this transformation lived in the details mechanics understood intimately. In field garages erected in liberated villages, the air smelled of grease, hot metal, and the peculiar sweetness of brake shoe dust. Mechanics worked with grease-blackened hands, cheeks smeared with fuel, performing maintenance rituals under unforgiving skies. They learned to love the Studebaker's brutish reliability, the engine that started when Soviet Gaz-Z trucks refused, the transmission that could be rebuilt with basic tools, the suspension that absorbed punishment on roads the Wehrmacht had destroyed during retreat. Soviet truck drivers developed small rituals that mixed superstition with practical wisdom. One driver would polish a headlamp glass before every sortie, believing a bright lamp protected against ambush. Others painted names and hometowns on cab doors: Volgograd, Leningrad, Smolensk, reclaiming identity in a military system that reduced men to unit numbers. Women volunteers and young male conscripts shared driving duties, enduring shifts that stretched beyond exhaustion as fuel. Shortages in tire wear meant constant improvisation. The human cost of keeping the trucks moving rarely appeared in official histories, but it lived in the worn brake shoes, the patched tires, and the jury-rigged repairs that kept vehicles operational when spare parts hadn't arrived. Tire scarcity remained a constant shadow. American tires and spare wheels were treated as currency, hoarded by company maintenance officers and traded between units like gold. A driver with 2 good spare tires was wealthy. One with 4 was a kingpin. Soviet civilians in liberated towns developed their own relationship with the trucks. Children chased Studebakers for spare rations. A single crate of sugar could feed dozens of families for days. Local memory preserved images. The sight of olive-drab trucks rolling through towns that hadn't seen motorized vehicles since the German retreat. The smell of diesel exhaust mixing with coal smoke from rebuilt homes. The sound of American engines idling in village squares while drivers distributed captured German bread or American canned goods. The Red Army improvised constantly. American radios and generators powered field bakeries that turned Lend-Lease flour into black rounds of bread for the infantry. Captured German equipment was married to American electrical systems. Soviet ingenuity met American standardization, creating hybrid solutions that neither ally had anticipated. What German intelligence failed to grasp was the scale of American mechanical presence at the corps level. When German units captured Soviet supply columns, they sometimes assumed the trucks were Soviet domestic production. The Cyrillic stencils and Soviet camouflage paint disguised the industrial origins. They underestimated how deeply American manufacturing had penetrated Red Army logistics, providing the unglamorous but essential foundation for Soviet offensive operations. The mechanized shock wasn't just tanks charging across steppes. It was ammunition trucks following armored spearheads, fuel trucks enabling sustained operations, repair teams that could reach broken-down vehicles within hours instead of days, and field kitchens that kept infantry fed during exploitation phases. Trucks converted tactical breakthroughs into operational successes by enabling the logistics that sustained momentum. But as Soviet armies pushed into Poland and approached Germany itself in winter 1944, the question shifted from whether the trucks could enable offensive operations to what would happen when the war ended and the industrial support stopped flowing. The liberation of Europe was being driven on American chassis, fueled by American gasoline, and fed by American rations. What would victory look like when the engine shut off? May 8, 1945, a clogged road outside Berlin. A captured German officer counted the vehicles in the Soviet column and stopped at 300. Half of them bore American stencils beneath Cyrillic paint. The road to victory had been paved with American steel, and now it led straight into the heart of the Reich. Captured German roads near Berlin in spring 1945 presented a tableau that would have been unimaginable in 1941. T-34 tanks advancing alongside Studebaker trucks, tarpaulins flapping in the wind, crates of foreign stenciled supplies visible through torn canvas. The supply columns stretched for kilometers, a slowly moving industrial front that turned raw Allied production into advancing Soviet armies. It was visually mundane, but strategically decisive, the unglamorous backbone of a military juggernaut that had driven from the Volga to the Elbe. The soundscape of Soviet victory mixed Soviet and American elements indistinguishably. Diesel clatter from Studebaker engines, horn blasts in rear areas coordinating traffic, the hollow hammering of rivets in repair sheds, and the distant rumble of artillery that the trucks were feeding with an endless stream of shells. Soviet mechanics in forward garages still pried frozen carburetors in late winter. Even in April, nights near Berlin dropped below freezing, pouring hot water from thermoses, while the air smelled of burning timber and thawing grease. The material reality of Soviet victory rested on statistics that told a story of industrial symbiosis. Roughly 400,000 jeeps and trucks from the United States and Britain had reached Soviet forces overall, an industrial avalanche of mobility that transformed how the Red Army fought. Lend-Lease had also supplied 1,911 steam locomotives and thousands of rail cars that made inland rail junctions capable of feeding frontline truck parks. The system worked because every component reinforced the others. American locomotives hauled American trucks to Soviet depots, where they were fueled by American petroleum products and loaded with American rations before driving on American tires to the front. Soviet post-war truck designs would show the imprint of this industrial transfusion. The ZIS and GAZI series that emerged in the late 1940s borrowed cab lines and drivetrain concepts directly from American models, a material inheritance that Soviet engineers absorbed through years of maintaining and studying Studebakers. The influence appeared in suspension geometry, in engine cooling systems, in the standardization philosophy that Soviet manufacturing had never fully embraced before the war. American industrial methods had been taught not through manuals, but through the vehicles themselves, disassembled, repaired, and studied by mechanics who would become the next generation of Soviet automotive engineers. But the human legacy lived in smaller, more personal spaces. Company histories and later memoirs recorded a formal Soviet acknowledgment. An often repeated story claimed Stalin sent a letter to Studebaker praising the US-6's service, though the letter's existence remains disputed. What wasn't disputed was the gratitude that lived in soldiers' memories. A Soviet artilleryman later wrote that Studebakers went where our gas choked, and that crews nicknamed them the American Savior for reliability under shellfire. These weren't official pronouncements, but the vernacular of men who had trusted their lives to foreign machinery and found it worthy. The texture of survival remained in the details that official histories overlooked. In forward kitchens during the final months of the war, the smell of boiled spam blended with black tea and the metallic tang of field stoves, an alloy of survival tastes that marked a generation. Soldiers described the oily, metallic flavor of American canned meat as simultaneously unappetizing and precious. Calories that kept infantry marching when domestic supply chains had been shattered by 3 years of total war. The mundane became miraculous through scarcity. A tin of powdered milk, a can of vegetables, a bar of American chocolate traded hands like currency in forward positions. Local civilian memory preserved images that contradicted Soviet propaganda about self-sufficiency. Russian children in liberated towns chasing trucks for spare rations, entire families fed for days from a single crate of sugar that fell from an American truck bed. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Soviet ideology emphasized independence from capitalist powers, yet survival depended on capitalist production shipped across oceans at enormous cost by allies who asked nothing in return beyond continued resistance to Germany. The strategic paradox became clearer as Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe and approached their final objectives. Soviet industry had performed remarkable feats of production after 1941, evacuating entire factories eastward, establishing new industrial centers beyond German reach, producing tanks and artillery in quantities that exceeded pre-war planning. But that production had been enabled by foreign support at every level. The high-octane aviation fuel that kept Soviet aircraft flying came overwhelmingly from American refineries. The aluminum for aircraft production arrived through Lend-Lease. The trucks that moved supplies, the food that fed workers, the machine tools that built weapons, all bore the mark of Allied industrial support. Marshal Zhukov's candid admission that Allied deliveries cannot be denied as they provided explosives, steel, and materiel that made reserves possible, captured a truth that Soviet leadership preferred to minimize in official histories. Victory had been achieved through Soviet blood and courage, but it had been enabled by American steel and fuel. The distinction mattered less on the battlefield than in the post-war narratives both nations would construct about their contributions to defeating fascism. As the war ended in May 1945, the Lend-Lease pipeline began shutting down. American production that had delivered 427,000 trucks Millions of tons of fuel, nearly 2 million tons of food, and countless other supplies over 4 years simply stopped. Soviet logistics officers who had grown accustomed to American abundance suddenly faced the prospect of maintaining operations with purely domestic production. The transition would prove traumatic. Soviet industry couldn't immediately replace the quantity or quality of equipment that had arrived from abroad. The legacy lived on in unexpected places. By 1945, entire Soviet mechanized corps had been built around American trucks, not as supplementary equipment, but as the primary logistics platform. The knowledge of how to maintain them, how to organize supply chains around standardized equipment, how to exploit the mobility that motorization provided, all of this became institutional memory within the Red Army. Officers who had commanded truck companies in 1944 would command divisions in the 1950s, carrying forward lessons learned from American engineering. Soviet veterans maintained complicated relationships with the memory of Lend-Lease. Official Soviet histories minimized foreign aid, emphasizing Soviet sacrifice and production. But in private conversations, in memoirs published after the Soviet Union's collapse, in the quiet acknowledgments between men who had served, the truth emerged. American trucks had been essential, not symbolic, not supplementary, but fundamental to the Soviet war effort. A mechanic who had stenciled Moskva Studer on a truck cab in 1943 carried that memory for 50 years, eventually sharing it with historians who were reconstructing the material reality of Soviet victory. These small acknowledgments, multiplied across thousands of veterans, painted a picture that official propaganda had tried to obscure. The Eastern Front had been won through an alliance of Soviet will and American production. The final image of Lend-Lease's impact appeared in Berlin itself. Soviet soldiers who entered the city in May 1945 rode in trucks that bore witness to an industrial partnership between ideological opposites. American chassis carried Soviet troops into the capital of the Third Reich, a symbol of cooperation that would be forgotten in the Cold War tensions that followed within months. Industrial alliance had enabled victory. Political alliance would not survive peace. The trucks that had rolled from Kuibyshev to Berlin represented more than transportation. They represented a moment when industrial capacity transcended ideology, when survival required accepting help from ideological opponents, when the mathematics of war proved more powerful than political theory. Soviet generals had been shocked when Lend-Lease trucks arrived by the hundreds of thousands, not because they doubted American production capacity, but because they doubted American willingness to deliver on such a scale. The Americans had delivered, the trucks had rolled, and the war had been won on roads paved with American steel, fueled by American petroleum, and supplied by an industrial system that had transformed the Eastern Front from a war of attrition into a war of mobile exploitation. The Studebakers would remain in Soviet service for years after the war ended, gradually replaced by domestic production, but never forgotten by the men who had driven them. They had come from a different world, a world of abundance that Soviet soldiers could barely comprehend, but they had served in the mud and snow of the Eastern Front with a reliability that earned respect deeper than ideology. American trucks had helped win the war. That truth, buried under decades of Cold War propaganda, remained written in the memories of veterans, in the design of post-war Soviet vehicles, and in the historical record that eventually emerged when archives opened. The road from Kuibyshev to Berlin had been long, brutal, and paved with industrial cooperation between allies who would become adversaries. But for 4 years, American production and Soviet blood had combined to crush fascism. The trucks were the sinew that held that alliance together, mundane, mechanical, and absolutely essential. Victory rolled on American wheels,